In previous chapters, we've been using orchestral libraries for film music and in various classical settings. But one thing we haven't considered is using these instruments in other musical settings, such as pop, soul, or funk. So right now we are going to look at brass instruments in relation to these musical styles. If we think back to the 80s, a lot of pop music used synthesized brass, and to be honest, it sounded somewhat cheesy. They sounded artificial and lacked dynamics. These days we have much better libraries, even if it is still somewhat difficult to find a library that would be realistic in creating a complete big band, for example. But of course, there are excellent libraries for individual brass instruments or brass sections. To show some examples of using brass in pop, soul, or funk, we have loaded a funk backing track. So let's listen to it and see what we can add to improve it. So that's a fairly simple backing track for us to enhance with a virtual brass instrument. And the first question we have is, which brass instrument should we use? We have already seen a variety of libraries, such as the VSL library, but we have to consider how we are playing the instrument in. If you simply play on the keys without taking much care and attention to the dynamics, it will still sound fairly unrealistic. So obviously we have to look into what forms of expression we are going to use. And also, there will be variety in just how funky the different libraries actually sound. Of course, if you are looking for specific brass effects and hits, then it is better to make sure that your library has a variety of these sampled, rather than trying to replicate them with pitch bend, etc. In this context, the VSL library might not be our first choice. It's an excellent library, but more in the classical style, and those funky effects and hits mean it would not be my first choice. In my opinion, the very best library for this comes from the company Sample Modeling. It is the most detailed and realistic sound library for this task. It's almost perfect in replicating a brass section. So, we will load this instrument, and we do this by first of all loading the contact player, and then on the left we have our library, and we can choose, for example, the trumpet from Sample Modeling. We'll load the main trumpet patch, and the first thing we notice is that it says, "Warning, CC11 not received yet. Instrument will not work properly." If we play our master keyboard, the trumpet doesn't play. It obviously needs continuous controller 11 in order to play. So, if we now reach for our controller, we can use one of the faders to control continuous controller 11. In effect, our controller is controlling the expression of the trumpet instrument. Now that the instrument has continuous controller 11, the warning sign disappears. The issue we have is that I prefer to have both of my hands free whilst performing the musical part. Usually my right hand will play the melody, and my left hand will choose, for example, the key switches, or will control pitch bend and modulation. For controlling brass instrument dynamics, I also prefer to use either the Akai Iwi or a breath controller. In our example, I can use the Tech Control USB breath controller. This simply attaches to your computer via USB, and is now controlling MIDI control number 2, which is the default controller for breath control. To set our instrument to receive controller 2 rather than CC11, we simply click in the drop-down menu and select the breath controller from that menu. Now I click Use Breath Control, and the instrument no longer responds to CC11, but to CC2. So now we can hear, by playing the keyboard and blowing on the controller, the trumpet is controlled from the keyboard and the breath controller. Whilst listening, you will have heard how the trumpet slides down to the next notes, and this is built into the instrument. if you let notes overlap and play the overlapping note with a slightly softer touch, the instrument performs the slide or the pitch down effect. To create a realistic brass section, it's important what happens between the notes, and we will have many examples of this in the following examples. I can remove the trumpet, as we already have a template for our brass instruments. This template includes all the instruments needed to form a typical brass section. One could say that the most typical brass section includes the trumpet, the alto sax, the tenor sax, and the trombone. Of course, you have a lot of flexibility to have 2 trumpets, for example, or to include a baritone saxophone as well, etc. But these 4 basic instruments are what we would typically consider a brass section. We can see that we have, apart from the trumpet and trombone, the saxophones that are prefaced with the letters SWAM, or SWAM. This abbreviation stands for Synchronic Wave Acoustic Modeling. The modeling instruments we are using are often not simply modeled using the physical modeling technique, but also include samples. So, they are a combination of physical modeling and sampling. If we open the trumpet instrument, we can see that it only uses approximately 60 megabytes of memory. This is quite a small instrument, and allows us to use it on older computers without too many issues. The body of the instrument is created using impulse responses, much like the reverbs are created in convolution reverbs. For this reason, the instrument is very playable and not static if it was simply a sample-based instrument. If we now look at the alto saxophone, we can see that it is not running under the contact player, but is using the SWAM engine. So these modelled instruments from sample modelling use their own engine. Much like on the other instruments, we have to decide which controller is controlling the expression, and on this instrument, we simply load the settings required by clicking at the top of the plugin window using the Load button. This opens a preset list, and we have 3 options. We have Wind Controller, which could be our Akai Iwi. Then we have a keyboard option, and at the top we have the Breath Controller option, which is the one that we will select. Of course, to create the most realistic interpretation of a saxophone, using the Akai Iwi would probably lead to the best results. But if you are a keyboard player, then it will obviously be much easier to perform using your master keyboard, but also being able to inject expression via a breath controller. There is a trick to allow you to use the Akai Iwi to simply control the note intensity, rather than having to play the actual notes on the controller. This means you can use the Iwi to perform the physical activity of playing a note, whilst still choosing the notes on your keyboard. In order to do this, you have to filter out the note data coming in from the Iwi, but this is clearly an advanced use of MIDI and something we won't cover right now. So back to our instruments. We can see that our instruments for the brass section are all from the sample modeling company, but the saxophones use the SWAM engine rather than the contact player. We could discuss in detail all of the options available to our different instruments, but the purpose of this tutorial is not to demonstrate or present libraries as such, but simply to show how to use these libraries. And what is important with libraries is that straight out of the box they sound good and allow you to perform your music correctly with excellent results. After that, of course, it's nice and also can be important that you can go in and adjust a large number of parameters in order to achieve more flexibility. But the root has to be that the instrument sounds good and is easy to start using. One other thing worth mentioning is that we have a reverb on an effect send, and the brass instruments are all being sent to that reverb. The reverb we are using is the internal reverb supplied with Cubase, called Reverence, and this is a convolution reverb. This is a more efficient way of using the reverb, compared to inserting a reverb on each instrument. It's also important that we added reverb because our brass instruments are all very dry. Some other libraries will include reverb on their instruments automatically, but in this case we need to add it ourselves. This is a good thing, to be honest, as it allows us the flexibility to choose whatever reverb we want, and how much of it we require. In Cubase, we can turn the reverb on and off here to compare.